All right, everybody, if you'd like to stand up for a moment and stretch your legs, please feel free to do so. Believe me, I know how it feels to have your knees feel like they're not working. Okay, thank you very much, folks. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Judie Jacobus. I am John Jacobus' daughter, who was a orphan train rider to Ottawa, Kansas in 1915. His was a very interesting life. And before I get into that, I would like to give you a little bit of information about how I became interested in the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, which became the National Orphan Train Complex. I don't recall the exact date, but my mother's best friend called her up one night and said, Louise, you've got to get a copy of the current Women's Day, or whatever it was, that used to be sold in the supermarkets by the checkout stands. And there was a whole article about Mary Ellen Johnson and the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America. And I immediately became intrigued because I had heard stories that Dad had told me throughout my life. And as I shared with Lori last night, he had to be in the mood to talk about it. You had to have your questions in your mind, or your questions easily accessible, because he would answer some questions, and then you could tell when he was shutting down and didn't want to talk anymore. So I was able to learn quite a bit about his early life. For instance, he was adopted when he was 2.5 years old. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and kept some of his Brooklyn accent his whole life, because it was always dis and dat and dees and does. So he came to Ottawa in 1915. He could never eat cooked oatmeal. And I asked him about that once, and fortunately he felt like talking about it. He said, because that's what they gave us in the orphanage. He remembered that, and he was 2.5 years old when he left New York. Also, he could never eat a leftover, the last of a leftover, but I'll get to that. He was born on June the 1st, 1912 in Brooklyn, as I said, and passed away September 11th, 2011 at the age of 99. The only thing that he could not beat or overcome was cancer. And he was very, very glad to have come here in 2006 and met some of you and have been able to see some of the exhibits and talk to some of the other orphan train riders. He was particularly drawn to Leela Newcomb because one time during that time of the 2006 meetings, he was off somewhere, and I was walking around in the freight area of the museum, and I asked Leela, how are you enjoying this? I was kind of sad. Well, why is that? Well, I was sent back, you know. I said, I know how that is, because Dad was sent back too at one time. He was really, and this is not a plug, this is just to mention this. Dad's story is in volume 6 of Orphan Train Riders and Their Stories, available at the depot. And his picture as a boy is on the front cover. On the back cover are all the riders that were there at the 2006 celebration who have since gone on to glory. And Leela is in the back. Dad is in the middle, sitting down. As soon as that picture was snapped, Leela went over, took Dad's head in both of her hands and kissed the top of his head. And that is a precious memory for me. More about my dad. He was pre-selected, meaning that he already knew the family he was going to when he went to Ottawa, Kansas. He was the first of what became 4 children. His brother and 2 sisters followed over the next 10 years. Dad was always very strong-willed and stubborn. He did not like to be told what to do in any way, shape, or form. And when he served in the Army during World War II, they wanted to send him to OCS, which is Officer Candidate School. And he always, not to the man's face, but to other people, he always referred to his sergeant as the old man. And when he told me about this, he said, the old man wanted to send me to OCS, and I said, well, I don't like to be told what to do, and I'm sure as hell not going to tell other people what to do. Typical of him. He had a good life in Ottawa in some ways, but not in others. His mother adored him. She absolutely would have done anything for him and was so good to him. His adoptive father, at times, was not. It was always referring to my uncle, my son Homer, my daughter Roberta, my daughter Helen. Oh, this is John. You remember that all his life. Dad lived in Ottawa, went to Ottawa University with a double major in math and chemistry. He wanted to teach in school. When he graduated from college with his degrees, the starting pay for teachers was $35 a month. Even in those times, you couldn't do much with $35 a month. So he stayed around the family home for a couple of years, and then his adopted cousin told him that Sunshine Biscuit was interviewing for jobs in Kansas City. He went up to Kansas City, applied, and became an accountant for Sunshine Biscuit. And they said, we're sending you to Phoenix. And he told me, my question to them was, where's Phoenix? Well, it's in Arizona. So he lived in Arizona for 7 years, I believe, until he was drafted in World War II. And that was interesting because toward the end of World War II, he said they were taking anybody that was breathing. Dad was cross-eyed for much of his early life. The best vision he ever had in one eye was 20/400. He compensated beautifully, but he did have his difficulties because of his eyes. But he became a medical corpsman and served in World War II in the Philippines in one of the field hospitals. After that, he came back, and the family had left Ottawa, Kansas, and come to Long Beach, California at that time. His adoptive father told him, you might try for a job at the post office. Government jobs are always available. Well, he was a postal worker for the next 29 years. He retired in 1972 at the age of 60, excuse me, and 2 years later, he went to work for local mortuaries, doing pickups, getting death certificates signed, and he worked there for the next 21 years until he retired again, and for the final time at 85. Throughout much of my childhood and my early life, and up until I was an adult, three of us traveled together because I was an only child. We saw 28 states of the United States. We went to Hawaii, we went to Alaska. We went to Europe 7 times, I believe. Saw China, saw Russia, all over Europe. I don't know the type of life I would have had if it hadn't been for my dad, because he instilled in me a strong work ethic. He instilled in me the love of home, family, and church. He instilled in me values that I carry with me to this day. And one of the best compliments I ever received was my mother saying, you know, Judy, much of who you are and what you are is because of your father. What a good compliment. Dad was certainly an unusual person because he could look at something and go home and make it out of wood. In my home now in Seal Beach, California, where I live in Leisure World, I have a homemade Parsons table, I have lamp bases, I have a bookcase, I have many, many trivets and cheese boards. And if you have gone in the train car area at the depot. You will see one of the trips Dad made, and I donated here. And I was happy to do so. He could look at something and build it, as I said. He could remember things that I would never even begin to remember. He could tell you what the symbol was, or actually what a symbol on the periodic table stood for up to his last year. What does such and such stand for, Dad? Oh, that stands for titanium. That stands for platinum, whatever. Me? He could look at something in the store and in his head figure out how much something was per ounce. Me? Give me my calculator, please. So, I am so grateful that I had the father that I did. And I'm so grateful that some of you got to meet him and see what kind of person he was. Because I never, ever lacked for support from that man. One night, my mother had gone to a church meeting. How many of you know about ladies' church circles? Good. Okay. She had gone to a church circle meeting. Dad came out of the bathroom and he said, "Do you have a PTA meeting tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Okay." And he grabbed his nylon jacket, went running out the front door, jumped off the front porch, and ran down the block to his car and took off and went to the PTA meeting. So many good memories. And to the person who asked about why were there so many abandoned children, it was interesting because at one time we knew very little about Dad's life pre-adoption. I wrote to the archivist of the Children's Aid Society, who immediately wrote me back and said my dad's birth father was unknown and his mother was believed to be Danish. And he was a foundling. Oh my. I took the letter over to my folks' house. My mother read it, she handed it to my dad, and he just dropped his hands into his lap and very quietly said, "Now I know." Made me sad to see the expression on his face, but at least he knew a little bit more about his early life. Does anybody have any questions that I could answer? Oh, and also, excuse me, in New York, in the early years of the 20th century, there were very crowded conditions. Sanitation was certainly not what we know it is today. Disease, in some parts of the countries, in New York too, disease was rampant. Cholera, typhoid, flu, people even died of flu at that time. And people ended up as orphans, where both parents had died, or half orphans. I don't know about Dad. Dad being a foundling, I don't know the circumstances of his adoptive parents, but he was given over to, I believe, the St. Luke's Children's Home, and he eventually ended up at the Children's Aid Society. And for the longest time, I wondered, why does my dad have the middle name Lukes, L-U-K-E-S? Last year I learned that sometimes the children were given the middle names of the children's home where they were placed. He was placed at St. Luke's. I just learned that last time I was there. So I am very grateful to have had the childhood and adulthood I had. I'm very grateful to both my mother and my father. And I couldn't have had better parents. Thank you very much. Any questions at all for me? Anything at all? And if you have a question, please stand up. I have macular degeneration in both eyes, and I see blurs out there. I don't see faces. Any questions? Yes, please. Stand up so I can see you and hear you.
You said there was another food, but you wouldn't eat.
Okay, I can't hear you. Let me come back there. Yes, all right. As I mentioned, my dad's adoptive father was not the best sometimes. I'll put it like that. And he would get the family would get the pot or the dish passed around. Everything always went to his brother and his sisters first, and then it came to him. Sometimes there wasn't anything left. Sometimes it was a very little amount. He would not eat leftovers. He would not eat the last of anything in the pot, which shows you the effect of things like that on children. I was a speech pathologist in the public schools in California for 20 years. Then I decided I wanted to go into the classroom. So I went back and got another credential and taught for 12 years. People do not realize how much a child's childhood sets their course for their whole life. They don't realize it. And things that happen in childhood, you never forget. I had an example of that with my dad, which certainly helped me in providing the best educational experience possible for my students and making sure they felt loved and cared for. Any other questions? Anything at all? Yes, Lisa.
Judie, thank you so much. I always enjoy hearing you talk about your dad. How did he first tell you that he was an orphan train? How did you learn that?
Well, it was interesting because asking that, I think my mother told me. As I recall. And he did not say too much. Oh, thank you for asking a question, because Anna Laura Hill was Dad's agent. I never heard him refer to her as Miss Hill or Anna Laura Hill. It was always Annie Laurie. Now, Annie Laurie did such and such. Annie Laurie did such and such. Dad, how do you remember Annie Laurie, I'd say? And he'd always say, big woman, big hats. And if you see her picture at the depot, she was a big woman and she wore big hats. So she was his agent, and a couple of years ago or more, there was a display on Laura Hill in the museum. Here was a little basket that she gave snacks to the children from as they traveled. I looked at that basket and I said, I wonder if that's the basket she used when she brought my dad from New York to Kansas. Choked up on that a little too. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you very much.